Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be here, although I feel slightly nervous. I feel that I'm like the turkey just before Christmas, coming to a load of chefs who are planning out the Christmas meal. It's wonderful to have this opportunity because, as you said, really it's something that really does deserve debate. One could answer very glibly and say, does the mind have a future? Yes, let's hope so. But it depends what kind of minds we think that we are going to have. Someone once said, for every complex situation, there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong. And I think that that applies very much to this. And I've been demonized by the likes of Ben Goldacre and the likes, as you probably know, in cyberspace, although I've never actually spoken to him. And people often say to me, is it true you say computers damage the brain? And let me say from the outset, I've never said that. And why I really appreciate the opportunity to speak and explore and discuss these issues with you this evening is because I think we are facing up to a really fascinating and complex situation that could offer actually huge opportunities at the same time posing threats. And we are not doing a service either to ourselves or to the next generation if we just put our hands over our ears and say la, 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 and that everything is just the same and we're inviolate. So my perspective is that of a neuroscientist, and that's why we start inevitably with the brain and the mind. I love this picture. I think that sometimes this is how people think of scientists as sort of dysfunctional nerds who at best are in their ivory towers or at worst bent on world domination in some way. Is this the future that holds for us? Are we going to become indeed cyborgs or somewhat dysfunctional robotic type children? In any event, we do know that this is something that's not an original thought. It's been debated and discussed for quite a while now, and I'm sure many of you, or some of you at least, might be parents who will have this concern, and even if you're not, you are a citizen of the 21st century. And so I think this is a really important issue as we face up to what the next generation will be thinking and what they will be feeling. Just to show that I'm not alone here, from an unlikely source, a concern voiced by Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, I worry that the level of interrupt, the sort of overwhelming rapidity of information, and especially of stressful information, is affecting cognition. It is affecting deeper thinking. So really, I'd like to go on from that and just explore what kinds of issues he might be meaning, what we are losing and what we are gaining, and how we can make the best of this startling new technology that I will argue is creating an unprecedented environment for us in the 21st century. Well, let's start with a bit of neuroscience, I'm afraid, and I assume that most people here are not kind of demon neuroscientists. Is that the case? Yeah, hands up who is. No one ends up. Or even a vague neuroscientist. Okay, so this is the fast neuroscience course in the country, and it really explores what we mean from a neuroscience perspective by the mind. And let's start by considering why we're so special as opposed to, let's say, a goldfish. And again, I'm not going to keep inviting audience participation by asking if anyone owns goldfish, but let's be brutal, goldfish don't have great personalities, do they? Let's be honest. You know, so that if you had a kid and it had a goldfish and the goldfish died, you could sneak off to the pet shop, get another goldfish. Child would come home and know no different at all. Now, you couldn't do that with a pet cat or dog, and much as they might want you to, you couldn't do it with their brothers or sisters. This is because as we escape from the narrow, stereotyped dictates of our genes, so we switch from instinct to something that human beings par excellence do better than any other species. We don't run particularly fast, we don't see particularly well, we're not particularly strong, but heavens, what we do brilliantly, which is why we occupy more ecological niches than any other, is that we learn, we adapt. And my first point, and the most important point, perhaps not just for this issue, but just in generally, if we are doing this fast neuroscience course, is that why the human brain is so special, better than any other species, although they do it to a certain extent, is that we will adapt to our environment. Wherever you put a human brain, it will adapt to that, be it the Amazonian rainforest, be it 5th century Athens, be it the centre of Oxford. The human brain is exquisite at adapting to its environment. This is something called plasticity, not meaning, of course, that the brain is made of plastic, but from the Greek plastikos, to be moulded. So let's look at that, and I shall argue that this is the basis of what we can call the mind. So this is how you started off your life. This is the first 2 years of your life. The blobby bits, and please forgive me if you are a neuroscientist for me using vernacular, the blobby bits are brain cells, and the stringy bits are the connections between them. Now, what is important and special is that even if you are a clone, that's to say an identical twin, you will have, compared to your twin, a unique configuration of brain cell connections because of the plasticity of the human brain, because the environment, your unique life story, is going to shape and strengthen and determine the pattern of those connections. And I shall argue that that in turn is what makes you the unique person you are. So for the 100,000 years human beings have stalked this planet, people have had livers like yours, lungs like yours, hearts like yours, and so on, but no one has a brain like yours, nor will they ever again. And that is what makes you so special. That is something surely we treasure, that we put a premium on, and that is why you'd never have a brain transplant probably. You might want to volunteer someone else for one, but while you have transplants of other organs, the brain is so different, because this is what makes you unique. Let's look a little bit more at this so-called plasticity, and I couldn't resist including this fascinating experiment which illustrates it very well. Okay, so in this experiment there were 3 groups of adult human volunteers, none of whom could play the piano. And a word of advice, if ever you get to volunteer for such an experiment, possibly not very likely, but if you do, try and not be in the control group, because they just stared at a piano for 5 days. Okay, now, there's another group, and they had more fun. They learned 5-finger piano exercises. And what we're going to see are brain scans over 5 days of the differences between the folk that just stared at the piano and those that played the piano, even over a 5-day period. But there's a further surprise. There was a third group, and they are the more astonishing, and I'm going to leave them as a surprise. You have those now. Okay, so look first at the top panel, and you can see that the brain is literally unimpressed. Nothing has happened to the brain scans over 5 days, as shown on the bottom. Meanwhile, the folk that learnt the 5-finger piano exercises, as you can see, there's a remarkable change in the brain territory relating to the digits even after 5 days. But the most exciting group, my surprise group for you, are those that the third group, and these people merely imagined they were playing the piano. And as you can see, they're pretty similar to the people that physically were playing it. So I don't know if there's any philosophers in the audience, people that like to distinguish mental from physical, mind from brain, people that cock a snook at people like me who traffic in the squalor of the biochemistry of the brain. But I would confront you with this if you are such an individual, because clearly you can see the crucial issue here is not the contraction of the muscle, which happened in the second group but not the third, but rather the thought that preceded it. And the man that actually developed the therapy still used today for Parkinson's disease, a severe disorder of movement, he had a wonderful quote. He said, "Thinking is movement confined to the brain. Thinking is movement confined to the brain," as you can see. Thinking is movement confined to the brain. Now, there's many thoughts and ideas that stem from this, but because of time pressing, suffice it to say the key thought I want to leave you with is just how exquisite your brain is to change. It is constantly on the move. Your brain cell connections are restless and dynamic and constantly moving. And the more you use them, as shown here, the fitter and better they become. Now let's look at the basis of that physically. And these are actually photos from my own lab, although the brain cells are not that I'm going to show you. And you can see how happy these rats look. Anyone who's familiar with rats can clearly tell this rat's having a lovely time, because rats are highly exploratory creatures, as I'm sure you'll appreciate. And they've been exposed here to a so-called enriched environment. Now, enriched for a rat doesn't mean the same as here. They don't come and have a hopefully interesting discussion about the perils of the internet or otherwise. For a rat, an enriched environment is one where they can explore and interact with lots of objects and indeed each other. And what we can do is can compare a brain cell from an animal in a more standardized lab condition from one that was exposed to a stimulating environment. And hopefully we'll get an idea of what happens to the brain that underlies these changes, this so-called plasticity. So this is a brain cell from an animal from an ordinary cage that was kept in humane but rather dull surroundings. And again, for those of you not familiar with brain cells, this is the main part of the cell, but I'd like you to focus, if you will, on the branches. Focus on the branches and compare those branches with these branches. And I hope you can see that in a brain cell from an animal in the enriched environment, the branches are more extensive. Now, why is this, and why is it important? Well, as you all know, when you exercise your muscles, they get stronger and larger. And in a sense, the brain is the same. The more you make a brain cell work, the more active it is, it too will respond, not just by growing, but by growing these branches, as you can see. Now, why is that important? Well, by growing more branches, you are increasing the surface area of the brain cell, thereby enabling it to form an easier target for other brain cell connections. So let's think that through again. if you stimulate the brain, if you make certain brain cells work hard, they will respond by growing branches, which in turn will enable them to make more connections with other brain cells. And that really is the heart, in my own view, of the mind. So let's think about that. When you're born, in the words of the great psychologist William James, you're born into a booming, buzzing confusion. And how do you evaluate the world? Well, you have no choice. All you can do is use raw senses. How sweet, how fast, how cold, how bright. But gradually, if this carries on, this erstwhile abstract visual pattern, perhaps of a face, you don't know it's a face, it will be a visual pattern, this sensory world, perhaps accompanied by certain smells or textures or colours or sounds, gradually this conglomeration of abstract sensations will start to, by virtue of your connections that are forming around it, give you a cognitive take on the world, from the Latin cogito, I think. So now, instead of seeing a visual abstract pattern, you will see a face, your mother's face. And if your mother, let's hope she does, features again and again and again in your life, then like with the piano players, so more and more connections will form in your brain, but not someone else's. They will have different connections. You will have your cognitive take, they will have theirs. And I like showing this picture, but in Oxford it doesn't really work, because perhaps you recognise some of these folk. So these are colleagues of mine who, let's assume you don't know who they are. Most people would see them as generic white middle-aged men in suits and ties. I know them as David and Martin and Tim and so on. And they feature a lot, or have featured a lot in my life. They would trigger, if you like, many connections. They would mean something to me that they would not mean to you. Similarly, you could put in your friends and family and colleagues. I would see them as generic men and women. For you, they might be the person that you love more than anything else in the world. They would trigger off lots and lots of associations that have a big significance to you. So in this way, you can personalise your mind. So we can talk about the mind not as some airy-fairy philosophical alternative to the physical brain, but the personalisation of that brain through the unique dynamic configurations of neural connections that are driven in turn by your unique experiences. And so you start off with, as a one-way street, going yuck and wow and yuck and wow. Well, you don't necessarily say that, but you're responding to raw sensations as they bombard you and drive your connections. But slowly, slowly, those connections will establish a two-way dialogue. That is to say, you will start to evaluate what's coming in terms of what's there already. And as you're having that experience, it will constantly update and change those connections. So you end up with this wonderful dialogue between your brain cell connections and the outside world, and that is called living your life. Okay, so sadly, this can go into reverse. Now imagine if you've got these beautiful connections that are unique to you, that are changing, responding, and enabling you to navigate your environment that you've been born into, your culture, speak your language, adapt you to your particular niche in the world. Imagine now if, unfortunately, those connections were dismantled. Imagine now if slowly, slowly you put your journey into reverse, and that slowly things did not make as much sense as they used to, because you could no longer see one thing in terms of something else. You could no longer resort to the checks and balances of previous experience that would reassure you or help you understand a situation. So rather like with a small child, the situation would again perhaps be frightening. You'd feel disorientated, you'd feel confused, because you could no longer understand. You couldn't see one thing in terms of something else because your connections had deteriorated. And I'm talking, of course, about dementia. Literally a loss of mind, as shown here in this rather charming Swedish lithograph, and mirrored in, as shown here, again, the growth and then the atrophy of the branches. I should add that neurodegeneration is not a natural consequence of aging, but rather it is a disease of older people, and therefore, as we all know, it is on the increase. So you can see here the embryo, the fetus, early postnatal and mature brain cell, characterised, as we've seen, by these fabulous branches, and sadly here thrown into reverse with dementia, a loss of mind. Now, there's also ways in which we can put our minds on hold in a temporary way, and we talk about blowing the mind. Can we think of ways in which one could disable those connections, perhaps temporarily or perhaps not? Well, here are some people who put their minds on hold. I don't think these people are in a cognitive environment. It's stripped of all cognitive content, yeah? And so I don't know what it's called now, but let's say a radio. And I'm way out of date, I know, if I say techno, or whatever people dance to. But I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps there's more experienced people than me, that these environments that people pay money to be in actually have a premium on raw sensation. You say you're going to have a sensational time. I wonder how many takers if I said, now, well, let's all go out, let's forget about this, let's go out and have a really cognitive time. Yeah, I don't think there'd be many people wanting to do that. Well, sensational time, yes. Blowing your mind, losing your mind. The very word ecstasy in Greek is to stand outside of yourself. And I don't think this person is self-conscious. Let's hope not. Yeah? So what you're doing is going back to that childhood state where you are conscious but not self-conscious, where you're the passive recipient of your senses. And it fascinates me that since we've stalked the planet, human beings have always wanted to be like this. For wine, women and song, the modern equivalent of drugs and sex and rock and roll are all about that. It's using chemicals, in my own view, in a misguided way, to pervert or distort or block the transmitters, the chemical messages that normally work between the connections, enabling them to function, or you put yourself in a strong environment where the stimulation is either thick and fast or is primarily sensory in nature, not requiring cognitive interpretation. And interestingly enough, we pay money to do this. We like doing this. We like sometimes suspending our minds and being on hold. So it's happened since, I don't know if there's any classicists here, we are in an appropriate place for this. I love the play The Bacchae by Euripides, showing here the poor old King Pentheus, who did not heed, like they never do, the wise prophet who said that he ought to tolerate the Dionysian worshipping, that's the worshipping of the god of wine by these crazed women. He didn't listen, tried to suppress them, and they tore him apart. There he is being killed, even as we speak. So that's having a sensational time. Letting yourself go, as I say, you can do whitewater rafting. This is from Australia. I love this one. Totally out of control. People are paying money to be out of control. Important. This guy doesn't because he's having much fun. And Fragonard's swing for the more sedate among us. So cross-culturally in time and space, there is this thread that I think characterizes human nature and is opposed to the normal adult notion of a mind and an identity and a self-consciousness where we do seek recourse sometimes in blowing our minds and losing our minds. Okay, so here you are living your life. Each of us has our own trajectory, our own past, our own future. And although we might temporarily blow our minds or lose our minds or resort to wine, women and song and drugs and sex and rock and roll, on the whole, we all have a life story. We all have a past, hopefully we all have a future. That past is unique to you. It's embedded in your brain cell connections. It's changing all the time as you're going through your life journey, but it's giving you an enduring and a persistent sense, and rightly so, of your uniqueness in life. So that is what I would call the mind and life. Now, that's the end of the neuroscience course, by the way. Well, kind of neuroscience course. This is where we get onto more delicate territory, and I'm sure there may be lots of thoughts on this. Let me again issue the health warning that although there's many advantages to the screen technologies, what I would like to do is focus on areas where I think there is room for us to do things and opportunities for us to do things rather than sitting back in self-congratulation and complacency. One statistic of many is the amount of time that kids are now spending in front of a screen. Here is just one such statistic. Between a child's 10th and 11th birthday, 900 hours in class, just under 1,300 hours with their family, and 2,000 hours in front of a screen. So I think it's undeniable that the environment is more pervasive than it has been in the past. And before anyone says, what about televisions in the middle of the last century, I remember when televisions were in the home and there was only one television, it was on for a few hours, and it was like the Victorian piano. We'd all gather around it, and certainly in my family talk all the time as the programs were on. Very different from being in your room for long periods of time, perhaps interacting with it, but in sort of solitary confinement with your telly. Very different notion. Just to show that I'm not a complete Luddite, I'm sure everyone here in particular is familiar with this book, which I think is beautifully written, has very persuasive arguments. For those of you who haven't read it, as its name suggests, it promotes some of the good points of screen technologies. And one particular point he makes, and I think this is really important, is that this might account for the rise in IQ scores that has characterized many different societies in the so-called developed world. And he argues that the reason for this is given the ability of the human brain to be good at whatever it rehearses. If you are rehearsing, if you're adapting, if you're living in a world where you are playing computer games, you are actually rehearsing just the very talents that are required for IQ tests. That is to say, looking at sequences, very agile and fast mental processing, all to reach a single goal at the end within a particular time frame. You are becoming very good at processing information and responding very fast. But he also says, and I think this is very important, yes, there may have been a rise in IQ scores, but there is no concomitant rise in brilliant novel writing or a concomitant rise in understanding of the economic situation, or insights into history or literature, as far as we know. There's been no similar increase in the writing of symphonies. So on the one hand, yes, it's good to be good at IQ tests, it's good to be good at information processing, but surely there is more to the human mind and our cognitive toolkit than just simply being good at IQ tests, as many educationalists will have testified for a long period of time. So there should be more than just information processing. What I find very interesting is we must distinguish between information and knowledge. And for me, information is responding to something as it comes in, whereas knowledge is more. Knowledge is understanding, and I would argue that understanding is being able to see one thing in terms of something else. Let me give you one small example of my small brother. Well, he's not small anymore, but when he was 3 and I was 16, he certainly was, so that I was able to torture him a lot. And of the many tortures I inflicted on him, one was that I treated him like a parrot. And I thought it was just very funny that he learnt Shakespeare. Yeah. So he learnt Macbeth, bits of Macbeth. And there he was at 3 years old saying, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day. You know, out, brief candle, life is but... Went down a storm in playgroup, of course. Out, brief candle, life is but now, had you said to him, Graham, that's fine that you've learnt that fast, much faster than perhaps a grown-up would learn it. But what does it mean? What does out, brief candle actually mean? What do you understand by that? He would probably have said something like, I just make this up now, when I had my last birthday cake, there was a candle on it and I blew out the candle. What he would not have said is, oh, well, that's obviously a metaphor for death. How was he? He's only 3 years old. He would never said that. So the issue is that only when you are older, when you have the conceptual framework where you can relate one thing to something else, do you have the ability to truly understand something. The more you can put something into a context and relate it to other things, the more deeply you understand it, I shall argue. And that is the difference between isolated facts and information processing and actually being able to understand something in the deep sense, that is, embedding it by virtue of connections. And as we've seen, as your brain develops, those connections are providing the hardware for you to do that. Okay, so let's think of other issues that some people promote as good. One is multitasking. I cannot see why multitasking is considered to be a particularly valued pastime. I love this. I just couldn't resist this. Right, sort of thing you've seen. Are we really going to end up, you know, with always the idea that we should be doing many, many things? In neuroscience terms, perhaps many parents know this already. If you look at scans of subjects who are either listening alone or seeing alone, but then asking them to do both, there is less listening with more multitasking. So the issue is that the brain, if you're asking it to do a lot, it can do that, but you can't do things to the same extent or the same depth. It only has a particular capacity. And the more we ask it to multitask, the less you can ask it to think deeply, is my suggestion. Because a screen, after all, will attract your attention to it, but then it will fragment that attention. And there'll be lots of things. Very rarely do you have just a single thing on the screen. There'll be hypertexting, there'll be adverts, there'll be things for you to look at, rather like when you're driving. And you will have to focus on some things and not on other things. And you decide and you respond efficiently and effectively. And when you do that well, you're effectively becoming a computer yourself. As I've said the human brains do, you've adapted to that world. Your brain has adapted to that environment where there is a premium on responding fast and effectively. In a way that is appropriate to the bombardment of the stimulation. But is that all there is? Well, another thing that worries me in terms of trends, if we look, is the increase in prescriptions for methylphenidate, better known perhaps, one particular brand name is Ritalin, given, of course, for attention deficit disorder. And as you can see, there's been a huge increase in prescriptions for drugs for attention deficit disorder. Does this mean, possible, that doctors are prescribing more liberally? Does it mean, again possible, that we are now medicalising a condition compared to the past? Or could it just mean, and this is not mutually exclusive with those possibilities, might it just mean that we are creating an environment for the young brain that mandates a short attention span? So one could imagine a scenario where a child, a young child, perhaps is exposed to fast interactive experiences, and that becomes the norm for them, that's what they adapt to, and then they go to school, and they have to sit still for half an hour, and so they fidget a bit, and then they're diagnosed as having an illness, and then they're given an amphetamine-related drug. Now, I don't know if that happens all the time. I'm not saying it is the case, but surely we owe it to people to explore that possibility. So let's just imagine you're a small child, and having shown you how sensitive the brain is, even to playing the piano, what would this do to your synapses, do you think? Yeah, it's exhausting just to watch it for a few minutes. Now, what's interesting is, of course, World of Warcraft, and I'm sure there's even more dramatic and more violent and more extreme games out there. In fact, I watched Channel 5 the other day and saw that they advertise those kinds of things. Because if you're a screen, you've got a hard job to do. You've got to compete with the real world. You've got to keep someone's attention fixed, and all you've got is two-dimension, and all you've got is hearing and vision. So how are you going to compete with this lovely, fragrant, touchy-feely, three-dimensional world? How are you going to compete with that? The only way you can do that is to be supernormal, faster, brighter, louder, more interactive, more exciting. You have to do that in order to keep, otherwise why should someone want to do it? So that's why I think, on the whole, we'll be looking at environments that are strongly sensory, as well as having a short attention span. We know little children that as soon as something's hidden from view, they're often on to the next thing. Again, another torture for my brother was I used to throw his ice cream away sometimes or do nasty things. He would burst into tears, and all I had to say, well, look at the bird. And suddenly, you'll know with small children, they smile. And whereas you'd have a depressed adult, and you say, look at the bird, you know. They don't thank you for that. That's not very effective, because they have a persistent cognitive take on the world, not one that's driven by strong sensory stimulation and inputs. Lack of metaphor we've touched on with Graham's inability to understand out brief candle. Just for fun, I took a very complex and interesting concept, honour, and I Googled on honour images, and this is what you get. Now, if you showed that to a Martian, do you think they'd understand what honour was, do you think? Whereas if they read Mallory's Mort d'Arthur, perhaps they might. So my contesting, and I open this as a challenge to you cyber people, how would you show, if you had a kid and you wanted to show them what honour really was, or make them understand or grasp the subtle, diverse, multi-nuanced notion of honour, the multiculturalism of honour, how could you do that with icons or images? I just find it interesting as a challenge to do that. We then come on to process and content versus the meaning of things, therefore. And we've already looked a little bit at the IQ tests. Say you're doing a computer game. Here we are, PlayStation 2. And here you are, you're going to rescue the noble Princess Yukihime. Do you actually care about her? Do you care about Princess Yukihime, I wonder, compared to if you read Tolstoy and you read about Princess Marya? What is the difference between these two princesses? Here, I would argue, you have a conceptual context in which Princess Marya is placed. That's why you care about it. Otherwise, you wouldn't read the book if you didn't care about the characters. The whole point of reading a book is they have a past, they have a future, they have relationships. They are interconnected, they have a conceptual framework. They have, therefore, a significance that I would argue Princess Yukihime does not necessarily have. And that significance, that concept, that meaning, is more on the idea towards understanding than simply information processing. And my own suggestion is that that's why we have to distinguish the two, information from knowledge or from understanding. And a book, which is very linear and very dull in sensory terms, and we say we think in a straight line, mandates a sequence of words in a sentence, sentences in a certain order, chapters in a certain narrative. And my own suggestion is that thinking is all about sequencing. The difference between a thought and a feeling, I think, is that a thought always has a sequence. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Whether it's a grievance, a dream, a fantasy, a memory, it always has a temporal sequence to it, whereas a feeling is just a feeling. And I think that this is facilitated in books in a way, perhaps, that when you are just responding to fast, not necessarily connected images, there's a difference. Now, if that's the case, if meaning is something that occurs only when you can relate one thing to something else, what will other people mean to you if they are, on the whole, kind of John and Jerry characters that are doing things, but where you don't empathise with them, where they don't have a significance, they don't have a past or a future or interrelationships? Might there be reduced empathy? Now, this is a very interesting issue. If we look at these two little boys, they're not communicating with each other at all. They are communicating with the screen. They're in the same room. They may be competing, but their main focus of attention is the screen, not each other. And yet we know that human beings put a premium when they talk on skills, certain skills. For example, eye contact. If you stare someone in the eye persistently, it freaks them out. If you don't look someone in the eye at all, it also freaks them out. So eye contact is a very subtle and important and varied activity that you learn subconsciously to engage with someone according to how well you know them, what kind of relationship you have, and so on. That's very subtle and very important. And along with body language, as you can see, it accounts for 55% of the impact you have on someone, as does the tone, the rate, and the volume of your voice. We don't know what impact pheromones have, those sneaky chemicals that you subconsciously pick up on that perhaps intuitively dictate whether you like someone or not. And physical contact, I recently had a bereavement, and I know only too well how important it is and the power of someone just giving you a hug. But of course, you can't just have any old person coming up and giving you hugs, and where they touch you and how they touch you is hugely charged and very, very important. Now, eye contact, body language, voice tone, pheromones, and certainly physical contact are not available on Facebook. All that's available on Facebook are words, 10% of the impact. So if you are a kid and you are, from an early age, primarily conducting your interpersonal relationships through a screen, how are you going to learn eye contact and when to hug someone? How are you going to learn how to evaluate their body language? So that perhaps if you're not used to that and then you do have to have a face-to-face conversation, let's be honest, it's hazard enough already for any of us, but how you might feel uncomfortable, it might be aversive, and that will drive you more into possibly the screen, the sanitized, simpler, safer, more remote communication of the screen. I just suggest that to you as an important issue, especially in relation when we're trying to pick up on empathizing with others, when we think about Second Life, which is primarily an action-based activity where you can, of course, be Vlad the Dragon Slayer or whatever you want to be. And this is particularly important. I know there are certain people here with an interest in autistic spectrum disorder because it turns out that autistic people are very comfortable in Second Life. They feel this a much more appropriate medium, a comfortable medium. And I would suggest it's because in such a place, the emphasis is not placed on interpreting body language or voice tone or empathizing or picking up on all these strange and funny clues with which they have difficulty. And I suggest that perhaps we all are towards a more autistic spectrum when we are engaged in these activities, and we are not necessarily depending on those other skills. So will we be seeing in the future reduced empathy? Now, if one's not relating to other people, and of course a brilliant way of relating to others is not just having conversations with them, by reading books and hearing what they feel and what they say in different cultures and at different times. If you're not having that opportunity, that environment, if you're living in the here and now, dominated by strong sensations, a world where if you play a computer game, you can just play the game again, if therefore nothing has a significance, what would that say about you? For me, again, I'd like to suggest that something that has meaning has a degree of permanence. If I drop something on the floor and pick it up again, that could well be called a meaningless gesture. Whereas if I shot someone, that would be very meaningful because it couldn't be reversed. And between that whole spectrum, on the whole, the reason that we have a meaning to what we do or to ourselves is because it can't just be reversed. Of course, you can apologize, you can have it color or change the direction in which you do or think something, but once something's happened, it can't be undone. And that gives things a significance. So if you are doing things that can be undone, or that have no past or have no future, what would that say about you as a person? Might it not actually make you feel you don't have such a robust identity? And I've got this from History of Blogging from the net. I love this. 1999, I just have to tell someone about this thing my cat did today. 2004, oh my God, cat pictures. YouTube 2005, moving cat pictures. And that pinnacle of civilization, Twitter. 1 p.m. my cat just sneezed. 1:02 cat sneezed again. 1:04 cat hasn't sneezed recently. Getting worried. Now, what does that tell us? And again, as always with the technology is neutral, and we all know about Twitter and the Arab Spring and the wonderful use it's had on that. I'm not criticizing the technology. I am criticizing this solipsistic drivel that comes out of it, you know, where people just give an account of what they're doing moment by moment. Why are people interested in this, or why do they think people are interested in this? Yeah? It reminds me slightly of people saying, look, Mummy, I'm putting on one sock. Look, Mummy, I'm putting on another sock. Because if you don't look at me, how do I know I exist? It actually is almost suggestive of someone that needs constant reassurance that they are there. So I would suggest that people that write this kind of thing are in some kind of existential crisis of identity. Yeah? So my own suggestion is that Twitter, perhaps, and the popularity of this, I say, solipsistic, constant readout of one's every movement, banal though it is actually reflecting a dodgy sense of identity that perhaps doesn't have a past or future. Okay, another area that I think is relevant is risk-taking. And we know Obama said that the previous financial crisis was due to recklessness and greed. So let's think about how risk-taking might be changed. There's an area of the brain, if you ask a neuroscientist or a neurologist to talk about risk, they will look for neurological examples of excessive recklessness. And we know that this area of the brain here, called the prefrontal cortex, seems to be very involved. The prefrontal cortex is exaggerated in humans, even compared to chimps. It's 33% of our brains, but only 17% of the chimp brains. And as for cats, if anyone's a cat lover, it's only 3%. Now, this area of the brain, which is a kind of kitchen sink for neuroscientists, because they put all sophisticated functions, a repository in here, isn't quite like that. It's responsible for the cohesion of the rest of the brain. It has more connections to all other brain areas than any other brain area. And we do know that if it's damaged, then many subtle and difficult things occur, not least recklessness. And we know that because of the most famous story of all, and no neuroscience talk would be complete without the story of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage, I'm sure you may have heard of him, was the foreman on a railway gang whose job it was to push down explosive with something called a tamping iron that was quite formidable. And one day, needless to say, the explosive went off prematurely, drove the tamping iron through his prefrontal cortex, and you might think that was the end of him. If you're squeamish, you might want to close your eyes. I'm going to show you a picture of him now. If you're not squeamish, don't say I didn't warn you. It was a pretty nasty wound, and you might think, well, he obviously died. No. You might think he was severely mentally impaired. No. What happened was he could walk and talk and see and do everything, seemingly perfectly normally, despite the fact he had a great hole in his head. These being heartless days without any National Health Service, and in the States, he went back to work, and it was only after a few months that people noticed a difference. And one of the things with him was he'd become more reckless, and this is not useful if people are dealing with dynamite. So what happened, and a poor team player and so on, so he actually left his job and earned a much more lucrative living as a fairground freak, showing off his wound, so he could afford to become an alcoholic, and then died of alcohol poisoning. That's Phineas Gage's story. But it did leave us with this notion that the prefrontal cortex, among many of the subtle things for which it's responsible, if damaged, would lead to recklessness. Now, there's another group of people who are also reckless in a similar way, can be studied now by gambling tasks, and I don't know if we'll hear about that from the next speaker. But this is a fascinating study showing that obese people are more reckless. Moreover, and we of course know obesity is a very important issue now, that if you scan their brains, they have a less active prefrontal cortex. And in fact, there's an inverse relationship between body mass index, that's how heavy you are relative to your height, and activity in the prefrontal cortex. Trust me, there is going to be a point to this. Another group of people with underactive prefrontal cortex are schizophrenics, as shown here. The subjects here are lying on their back, nose in the air, prefrontal cortex indicated by the arrow. Now, what do we know about schizophrenia? Well, we know that it's a world dominated by the senses, where quite often the patient feels that they're being imploded by the outside world. They have very fragile and capricious associations or logic, but mainly it is very dominated by a sensory world, often giving the illusion their Christ come again, because everything's so bright and shiny. Very similar to childhood, they are easily distracted, a short attention span, an inability to interpret proverbs. You say to a schizophrenic, people who live in glass houses mustn't throw stones. What does that mean? A bit like my brother with the candle. They say, well, if your house is made of glass and I throw a stone, your house will break. They can't interpret proverbs, and they both have underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. What's fascinating is that evolution is reflected in development, and just as the prefrontal cortex is much bigger in humans, even compared to chimps, so it's only fully active in late teenage years or the early 20s. So it's a fascinating parallel. And you can see here that we're starting to see a connection. Indeed, Phineas Gage was remarked on as being particularly childish or a child by the physician, John Harlow, that attended him. So where do we put this? Well, what do we know about childhood and how that might be similar to eating a lot or gambling? Well, I think the clue lies if we look at schizophrenic paintings. This is a very famous set of paintings, starting with a cat that's recognizable, going through down to here, and I would challenge you or defy you to say you recognize that as a cat. It's more a sensory. So we've gone from cognitive actually to sensory. And could that be it? Could it be that an underactive prefrontal cortex is associated with one where the senses dominate over the cognitive? Anyone who eats knows the consequence of eating, but the thrill of the food trumps the fact that you might get fat. Anyone who gambles knows the consequence of gambling, but the thrill of the roulette wheel or the roll of the dice trumps the fact you might lose all your money. So could it be that we have an association here with an underactive prefrontal cortex and recklessness. So let's put that together and think about how that relates to the screen. With a lot of the screen activities, as we saw from that little clip, you can be highly aroused and excited. Many people become addicted, as we know, and perhaps we'll talk about that later. And it can be rewarding, otherwise why do it? Now, in brain terms, there is one chemical that links these three functional states, but it's only a bit player. It's not the chemical for arousal or the chemical for addiction, but it is released with all addictive drugs, irrespective of what they are. And that's a chemical you may have heard of called dopamine. And what we know about dopamine, it's like a fountain in the brain. It comes from a very primitive part of the brain, but it acts in a very diffuse way. But the only part of the cortex, the outer part of the brain, that it accesses is, guess where? The prefrontal cortex, where it is inhibitory. So let's put that together now. We could have two basic modes of the human brain where we look at prefrontal underfunction and activation. On the one, strong feelings. On the other, thinking dominates, sensory, if you like, versus cognitive. Here, characterized by living in the moment. Here, you have a past, a present, a continuity beyond the present moment. Here, the external environment drives your consciousness. Here, internal perceptions will override those and give you a sense of a continuity. Here, there is little meaning. What you see is what you get. Here, a highly personalised meaning, the way you interpret the world around you. Here, you've let yourself go, a reduced sense of self. You've blown your mind, lost your mind. Here, a strong sense of self that dominates. Here, no time and space, you're just in the moment. Here, clear episodes that make up your life narrative. Here, infants and children. Here, older children and adults. Unless, of course, you take drugs or go in for drugs and sex and rock and roll or go to Queensland and go on that fun ride or do whatever you want to do, in which case one will go to the left. And often human beings have done that. And ever since Euripides wrote the Bacchae, we know that there's been this balance between the two. This more dopamine, this less dopamine. So far, so good. But my suggestion is that this world on the left is one that will dominate more with the screen environment, and therefore we might be skewing this age-old balance in a different way in favour of the left-hand panel. So what I'm suggesting could happen is intense stimulation of the screen will mandate a fast response. That will be exciting, and that will be associated with the release of dopamine, which is released during high arousal states. Amphetamine, for example, works by releasing dopamine. This will underlie reward-seeking addictive behaviour. More dopamine will be released. That will cause underfunction of the prefrontal cortex, which will cause more fragmentation in activities of brain areas, simulate the conditions of childhood schizophrenia and obesity. There will therefore be a drive for sensation rather than cognition, and you'll seek out a greater appeal of the screen environment, and that will therefore be a kind of ongoing cycle. This is a shameless plug for my book that says this, available on Amazon at whatever it is, $8.99. I'd just like to conclude, I know we're short of time, by just showing that I think there's some constructive ways forward. And this is perhaps the most nervous part of my talk, because really it's just some suggestions for the kinds of software, if it were possible, that might make up for some of the areas that I at least myself perceive, as areas that we could sneak opportunities. One would be my life story, where you had a Facebook-type activity, but for the user only, and you just sort of typed into that. It would be a diary impossible to share with anyone else, and you could therefore perhaps develop a sense of privacy, an enduring sense of self, and a narrative where you learn you don't need feedback or comments from others, but yourself. Who am I? Where you input over time, and you have performance on a whole range of activities, and that builds up into a kind of personality trait profile. Other people's minds, where you have a conventional visual sequence of fast-moving events, but then you slowly reduce the speed, and you start to have words rather than pictures, and at different times you actually have intermittent questions. What does it all mean? You enter random ideas and blogging, and you start to develop your individual conceptual framework, which I've said I feel at the moment could need work on. Consequences, I think it's a very bad lesson to learn that actions don't have consequences in the real world. Of course they do. So couldn't you have games that are permanently changed? Once you've killed someone in that game, they'll never be alive again. And you could perhaps interface to people actually saying what it feels like to be shot. One of the awful things that I feel, again, is testimony to this is happy slapping, where people, of course, bully people and torture them physically and mentally and put this on YouTube. What kind of monsters would do this? Perhaps people that don't understand or empathise what it really feels like to be hurt. And finally, imagine, this is perhaps the nightmare of all, where there's no menus whatsoever. I hate menus. You know, whether it's you phone up answer phones or you're on PowerPoint or Word, you have fixed options and you have to trudge up and down those little trees. to do that. Imagine no menus where you have a starting point with a word or an idea or an action that would freely link to anything else. And so icons or pictures of the entry would slowly be replaced by words or voice, and over time this will build up into your framework of associations. I'd like to conclude by drawing an interesting parallel that you might think is somewhat far-fetched, but I think is important, with climate change. With climate change, as we know, there's no, as I've said at the beginning, there's no simple answer. There's no one simple problem. There's many questions: carbon sequestration, alternative energy sources, and the like. There's various views. Some people think it's exaggerated, people think it's a lost cause and we're doomed. Others think that science can help. The private sector interest and branding is really important. Look at how BP changed their logo from a shield to a flower. Really important in terms of goods and services, and the consumers and products and their risk management. In the public sector, of course, there's an importance for education and regulation. It's impacting on national and international polity, and above all, is an unprecedented feature of the 21st century. We all know this. Climate change is a very familiar part of our lives now. But what about if we change just the first bullet point here and varied what the examples of the questions were to the impact of gaming on how we take risk and manage risk, on how social networking sites like Facebook impact on identity, and how we could convert information into knowledge. Apart from that, this slide is identical to the previous one. And I'm suggesting that just as climate change is now a complex and important part of our lives that we're having to come to terms with, so we could call this mind change. And I think that these parallels could be quite interesting to develop, where again we are not just dismissing it, we're not reducing it to a simple problem, but it's something that will be very important for the lives, if not of the current generation, certainly the upcoming generation. Above all, I think it's really important that we think of ways in which we don't just talk about information downloading, information processing, but we think more indeed about understanding and knowledge. Thank you.